to the launch, or rather the first talk by the UCSC BIOS Research Cluster. You probably wonder what BIOS stands for. Well, it's two things. One is biosurveillance, and the other is bodies imaged to be obstacles to security, which is a little bit more awkward. And so, you know, our focus is to look at the intersections of surveillance, the body, and security at a number of different scales and from a number of different perspectives, including not just medical stuff, but also mental and the mind. And I've organized a UC system-wide research cluster with the goal of trying to get some Humanities Research Institute funding. I don't know how that's going to turn out. But in any event, Rebecca Hester is here to give a talk, Dr. Rebecca Hester. And it's the first of two talks, and you're probably also wondering why two. Well, it turns out Rebecca is at Stanford for 2 Mondays this month and next month, one each month. And so given the proximity, I thought, well, you know, I would bring her down to do two talks, right? Two for the price of none, as it turns out.
That's a hard sign, yeah.
Rebecca is a PhD graduate of the UCSC Politics Department, finished a few years ago, and has been, most recently still is, at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, in the Institute for the Medical Humanities. And as she constantly tells me, nobody is quite sure what medical humanities are. And so the school is a little bit troubled by this. Her emphasis here was on Latin American and Latino studies, and her research, in addition to this, focuses on the politics of the body as they are manifested at and through the intersections of immigration, health, and security. And I have to say that, okay, that this is co-sponsored by not just the research cluster, but the Center for Global, International, and Regional Studies, College 8, the UC Humanities Research Institute, the Center for Cultural Studies, CLRC, the Institute of Arts and Sciences, Politics, and LALS. And so this is why I'm a little bit annoyed at the lack of a mob. But in any event, I'm going to turn the floor over to Rebecca.
Good, okay, well.
Oh, I know, I want to say,
yeah.
We have a chapter in this massive book by an obscure publisher. It's called Surveillance and the Social Implications of Microchip Implants. I mean, it's a real paranoid volume, but I have a copy of it. It's probably the only one on the campus if anyone's interested in looking at it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, okay. Well, thanks for that introduction, and thank you, Ronnie, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming, and to all of those sponsors. When I saw that, I felt a bit overwhelmed, because I was like, oh my God, there's going to be a mob, but I'm actually happy we can maybe have a conversation. So what I want to talk with you today is a project that I'm just at the beginning of that largely focuses on the question of biological danger. What is biological danger today? Who is biological danger? What constitutes biological danger? And so I'm looking at this through the lens of health and migration, which has sort of been my focus since doing my PhD. And I've really been focused on questions of race and racism, also gender and sexuality. But with this project, certainly, welcome, hi, on race and racism. This particular project has also emerged out of sustained conversations with biodefense researchers at my university. We have the only level 4, which is the highest level biosafety lab on an academic campus in the nation. So we regularly get folks who are in biodefense, people who deal with biological weapons of mass destruction, policy makers, and other folks coming through there. And then I regularly sort of meet with the biodefense researchers and engage in conversations and symposia series and things with them. And then finally, the work that I've been doing with Ronnie for the last couple of years on the cyborg and, you know, other questions of microchipping and biosurveillance. So bringing all of those sort of trajectories together has informed what is, I hope, to be the very beginning of a project on biological danger. And what captivated my attention really was a speech that Obama gave to the UN. And the speech was titled, On the Pursuit of Peace in an Imperfect World. And this section specifically caught my attention, where he says, to stop disease that spreads across borders, We must strengthen our system of public health, and we must come together to prevent, detect, and fight every kind of biological danger, whether it's a pandemic disease like H1N1 or a terrorist threat or a treatable disease. So what really struck me about that is the idea, first of all, it's the first time I really saw this question of biological danger posed, and how it was that it seemed that there was a seamless conflation in his statements between migration, terrorism, human bodies, and zoonotic diseases all together. And it came together sort of with an imperative to address this biological danger as part of the vital and collective work of multiple sectors, right? So this is not only a public health problem, it's also a question of peacemaking, it's also a question of national security. And it's a question certainly of what we have come to frame within the research framework where I work as the biodefense agenda. So it struck me that there was a lot, and it was not a huge part of his speech, but there was a lot in it. So I started to sort of follow this, and one of the idea that I'm working with is the idea that his pursuit of peace is actually a call for war on biology. Okay, so, and how I'm locating this in sort of the Foucauldian framework on state racism, and really trying to call attention to what I think is a new chapter in a historically informed war that's defined and been defined by race struggle in the West. So I'm not saying there's anything new in this kind of, certainly we saw eugenics, there's a long genealogy of these kinds of things, but I'm trying to sort of call out a new aspect of this longer historical war, okay? And one of the characteristics of it is that it's what I'm calling a prophylactic war, right? So it's being waged on medico-legal terms and advanced through this emerging field of epidemiological criminology, or epicrim as it's called, in which where there's a sort of conflation between ideas about criminology and a viral threat or some sort of epidemiological threat. Okay, so what are my concerns? As I said, this concern of sort of bringing together questions of state racism, migration, and then contemporary molecular politics. Okay, so what are the biopolitics of biological danger? And this question of who should be made to live and who should be let die, I think the way I'm trying to locate it within the question of biodanger is through virology, immunology, microbiology. So the life sciences really are having a very central role to play in the launching of this, the detection of this, the prevention of this, and as I'll argue, the eradication of this. Okay? And I think one of the things that's occurred to me in recent years is how much Homeland Security and public health have become much more sort of imbricated, right? They've become much more entangled. And so within this war, and I'll sort of lay out some anecdotes that kind of show this, any living being, that is person, plant, or animal, can be targeted, and any intervention against such danger can be justified within the war on terror. And this is largely informed by some of the stuff that I've heard at the lab. Okay, so who are those against whom society must be defended? Both within Obama's comments and with the emergence of swine flu, both the infectious disease, right, the respiratory infection, H1N1, and Mexican migrants were framed as biological danger. And so one of the things I'm posing is that the production of Mexican migrants as biological danger, or effectively biological enemies, marks a shift in anti-immigrant logics at the turn of the century. Okay? And I'm sort of calling attention to the migration aspect of it, but I do have concerns that any biological being, right, so that the human race also, sort of writ large, is implicated in this kind of a politics, in this kind of a war. All right. So how is it that these immigrant narratives are being reframed? So what I'm calling ontological stasis, the idea that historically the race war, and particularly against Mexican migrants, has been framed in terms of their lack of acculturation, their lack of assimilation, right? Their ways of being as unchanging and unchangeable. So they are an economic burden who come and have anchor babies. They're a welfare drain. We know these sorts of logics. Certainly, there's an idea of cultural fixity in Samuel Huntington and Peter Brimelow. Both are sort of at the forefront of that idea that, there's Huntington lays out 6 reasons why Mexican migrants won't assimilate and why we're going to become the new Canada, and really have linguistic and cultural differences that are sort of incommensurable. And then, as I said, there's a sort of longer history, longer genealogy of race as being sort of biologically entrenched and sort of genetically entrenched and then passed down. So you've got racial inferiority and racial superiority sort of understood as kind of happening at the level of the full body individual or at the level of the population. Okay, so these kind of ontological stasis narratives have been focused on who migrants are and how they live as fixed characteristics and properties. Okay, and I sort of want to say that the narrative of the sort of molecular and the viral flips that idea on its head. So what we've got now is an emerging immigrant threat, one that I'm calling viral chaos, in which we have a fear of biological mutability and mobility in addition to those other ideas of cultural fixity. So we've got two things working at once. On the one hand, we see migrants as we're still with that narrative of cultural fixity, but on the other now, what we're afraid of is not their stasis, but their change. We're actually afraid at the molecular level. We're afraid of their mutability. We're afraid, right, and here you can invoke the movie Contagion, right? You don't know who's contagious. You don't know if you've been around someone who's contagious. You don't know how they will infect you or whether indeed you yourself have been infected. And so this kind of level is not one that you can read in a phenotype, that you can see and claim in an anchor baby. It's a kind of new invisible threat that's occurring at the level of the molecular. Okay, so you get unpredictability, invisibility, and in sort of I guess political science speak, you get these sort of non-traditional threats, or in Rumsfeld's terms, unknown unknowns, right? So in this narrative, what you get, it's not only who and what migrants are, but simply that they are, right? The existence, their very existence is threatening. Okay? So as I say, I think that this sort of viral chaos narrative flips anti-immigrant discourses on their head. And so now I'm sort of trying to think about molecular migration, not population migration, not individual migration, but what would a molecular migration framework open up for us? So now, and what kind of threat does that pose? So rather than fearing their immutability, their cultural stasis, concerns are emerging about the mobility, mutability, unpredictability of migrants, not as individual bodies or populations per se, but as moving masses of unpredictable molecules. And if I were better technically, I would have had these moving around here, but I don't know how to do that. So anyway, okay. So here what you get is, I don't know if you've seen the film World War Z, but on the one hand, you get sort of the migrants coming over the fence. On the other, you get this sort of zombie apocalypse, right, coming over, and it's in a similar way, right? So unpredictable, uncontrollable, contagious, infectious, and coming to a country near you, right? Okay. So what are the theoretical underpinnings of this emerging threat or this unknown? And how am I framing it? So I'm using a couple of different indicators to sort of say, where is it that we can see it? How do we track it? How do we theorize it? And I'll go ahead and talk about these in turn. So one is the emergent diseases worldview, which Nicholas King has coined, and he understands it as a perspective in which infectious disease is perceived as a non-traditional threat. So it's not the big soldiers with the big guns. It's not the nuclear weapon standoff. It's something that, again, it's not detectable. It's not traditional. And it's coming, as I say, to US citizens, not only at home, but also abroad. And you'll see this when I talk a little bit about Obama's recent global health initiative. And it's held to exacerbate social and political instability in key countries and regions where the US has significant interest. In other words, these kinds of diseases, infectious disease, public health questions are not just questions about, do they threaten people and their well-being, but they threaten entire countries, entire regions, right? They threaten to throw all of it into chaos. So what we've seen then is the securitization, the sort of discursively produced idea that migration is a homeland security issue or a national security issue, public health is a national security issue, infectious disease is a national security issue. So we can see that we've gone from populations farther and farther down into sort of the molecular level, and we've securitized at every level each of those components of life. And then, as I said, molecular mutability and and what has informed this? We've seen the molecular turn in the life sciences. That's been a huge part of it. But there's also, in conjunction with that, has been the resurgence of infectious diseases in the 1980s. HIV/AIDS was the first of the infectious diseases to be securitized and to be read as a security threat. HIV/AIDS, we've seen cases in the US actually of criminalization for people who've transmitted HIV/AIDS, and we've also seen this with TB. So this has been framed as a real danger, a real security threat. And certainly related to that is the idea that these strains, the more we sort of push pharmaceutical interventions for them, what we're getting are drug-resistant strains. So that's a threat, because if then people get infected, we have no way to be able to stop it. And then finally, the anthrax letters that were just a month after 9/11, we saw the anthrax letters, right? And so that was a big scary for us. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Is that now we are in an age where we're looking at the molecular makeup of mobile populations as a political concern in a new way. And here I'm drawing from Bruce Braun, who says, and I'll read this, at the same time that molecular biology and genetics have given us a body known at the molecular scale, and thus made the physical mechanisms of life available to political and economic calculation in new ways, they have also, in conjunction with the science of immunology and virology, given us another way to conceive of our biological existence, no longer in terms of a self-contained body whose genetic inheritance is to be managed and improved, but in terms of a body embedded in a chaotic and unpredictable molecular world, a body understood in terms of a general economy of exchange and circulation, haunted by the specter of newly emerging or still unspecifiable risks. So this is what I'm talking about, and particularly I want to show how this gets sort of imposed onto the bodies of Mexican migrants. So mobility is part of this story, and so what happens, according to King, is how does this get transferred from sort of our concerns about molecular sort of mutability writ large, and then sort of get imposed onto or attached to particular bodies. And so he theorizes it within this idea of the emerging diseases worldview that it comes equipped with a moral economy and historical narrative. It sort of explains how and why we find ourselves in the situation that we do, but also in order to do that, we identify villains and heroes. Hi, welcome. And ascribe blame for failures and credit for triumphs. So who are the villains in this story, and what are the terms through which blame is ascribed? Okay. The terms, essentially, as I'm sort of arguing, are this threat of bioterrorism. And what struck me about this definition of bioterrorism is, at the bottom what I bolded, it doesn't require that the biological agent be a select agent, right? It doesn't require that it be anthrax. It doesn't require that it be hantavirus, or it doesn't require that it is some high level, what we call a select agent bioweapon. Only that the agent is capable of causing biological malfunction, disease, or death in a living organism. So that troubles me about what could be a threat, what could be termed within the context of the Criminal and Epidemiological Handbook of the US Department of Justice, what could be considered a biothreat. Okay, so really the question is, can we really consider migrants to be WMD? Is that really what we're talking about? I am suggesting that, yeah, any biological agent within this context can be categorized as WMD. And this was really brought to my attention when I attended a talk at a symposium in the GNL, the Galveston National Lab. And Ed Yu came in. He works for the FBI Biological Countermeasures Unit and within the Directorate for the Weapons of Mass Destruction. And he was talking about bioweapons, and he was talking to the researchers about the FBI's concerns with bioweapons, and did this really sort of big, scary PowerPoint about who, where we need to look out for, and sort of, Yersinia pestis, and the rats getting out and infecting everyone, and had all of this stuff. And at the end of his talk, I raised my hand and I said, can you tell me, when you're talking about biological weapons, are you talking about on their person or in their person? And he didn't answer the question. And so I went up to him afterward and I said, I'm sorry, let me rephrase. And I said, are you talking about on your person, that, if a person is carrying a weapon, or inside of your person? And he said off record to me, he said both. That's what we're talking about. So I thought, okay, that's very interesting, that is a perspective, right? So we're talking about a new kind of suicide bomber, as it were. And he cited in his talk something that had happened in the White House. This retired Air Force Colonel Randall Larson, who, in the last time I showed this, someone said that my image distracted him because it looked like he had a mop on an egg. His toupee was distracting, which I thought was kind of funny. But anyway, so he told a story within that presentation about Randall Larson had gone through all the security clearance in the White House to go visit the president, or maybe it was the vice president, but he got in, he went through the metal detectors, went through the pat-down, ends up in the office that he's going to for his meeting, opens up his briefcase or opens up his shirt or something and says, here it is. And he had brought in sort of a sister of anthrax. It was a non-toxic sort of sister of the much more threatening biological weapon. He said, you guys are looking for the wrong thing, right? So we've got on your person, in your person kind of biothreat happening. And so here what we see is with the definition of what a bioweapon is and the idea that it can be in your person as on your person, the doors sort of swing wide open for trying to figure out now who could potentially be this threat. Okay? So here I'm drawing from Foucault to sort of say that, we've got this sort of racism that kind of can attach itself, as I said, historically, and I'm arguing that it's attaching itself not only to the bodies, but to the very molecules of Mexican migrants in the contemporary context. And so what we have is racialized border crossers who are seen as contagious contaminants, viral vectors who threaten the very existence of the national body. And you may think that's hyperbole, but I'll give you some examples drawing from some things that media folks have said, as well as some policy folks. So just a little bit of background on the swine flu. With the emergence of the swine flu, people thought that it was porcine derived, but actually it was a combination, right, of bird flu and bird, pig, and human viruses. And the patient zero for that what they framed as a pandemic came from the southern state in Mexico. Within 2 weeks of the outbreak, over 8 people in Texas and California were diagnosed, and 68 people in Mexico had died. And so it was framed very early as a potential pandemic, and then it actually did reach pandemic proportions. And the global response was, sort of a geography of blame and shame. We saw people, Mexican people all over the world enshrouded in discourses of, security and danger and risk. In China, they were quarantined, and 70 Mexicans were pulled off of a plane, put in a hotel room, quarantined for some time, and then actually shipped back to Mexico. Folks in Japan and Indonesia, as they were walking through the airports, they got pulled, and their temperatures were checked. Air travel to and from Mexico was closed. Soccer pitches, schools everywhere throughout Mexico also closed down. Chile refused to host soccer players, and the one that interests me here is Haiti also refused supplies from Mexican ships, right? It was just too much of a threat. It was seen everywhere as too much of a threat. And so what happened in the US at that time? Well, what we got were a lot of media personalities starting to opine about what this meant for the nation. Here is one, Michael Savage, right? Who sort of had a ready identification of Mexican migrants with bioterrorists. And here he says, he speculated that swine flu was a conspiracy by radical Islamists who concocted the virus and planted it in Mexico, knowing that Homeland Security Director, now head of the UC system, would do nothing about it, right? And he went on to speculate that, quote, terrorists are using Mexican immigrants as walking germ warfare weapons. It would be easy, Savage said, to bring an altered virus into Mexico, put it in the general population, and have them march across the border. Okay, but he's not the only one. Radio host Neil Burtz says, what better way to sneak a virus into this country than to give it to Mexicans, right? I mean, 1 out of 10 people in Mexico is already living up here, and the rest are trying to get here. So if you want to get that epidemic into this country, get it going real good and hot south of the border, and then just spread a rumor that construction jobs are available somewhere, and here it comes. And some of these comments actually went a little bit farther, and someone said something about, in addition to VD and mustaches, now Mexicans are importing. It's surprising that they haven't imported poxes of different sorts, right? Oh, here it is. Jay Severin. So now, in addition to venereal disease and the other leading exports of Mexico, women with mustaches and VD, we now have swine flu. We should be, if anything, surprised that Mexico has not visited upon us poxes of more various and serious types already, considering the number of criminal aliens already here. Okay, so we've got several media personalities who have quite extensive followings in the millions, in the tens of millions, making comments, right? And so spreading this idea. And so one might say, well, that's just sort of half-baked bluster by ignorant xenophobes who just have a bone to pick with Mexican migrants. That doesn't mean anything. But indeed, on June 3rd of 2009, just a few short months after the swine flu outbreak occurred, The Washington Times reports that U.S. counterterrorism officials had authenticated a video that, Al Qaeda was basically trying to smuggle bioweapons into the U.S., right, via tunnels, and that this was the latest sign of their determination to stage another mass casualty attack on the U.S. So this is in the Times. So now we're getting sort of more legitimate media sources. But then at the same time, we had Louis Gohmert, who was saying that we know Al Qaeda has camps over with drug cartels on the other side of the Mexican border. We know that people are now being trained to come in and act like Hispanic when they are radical Islamists, right? And in the original version of this, I had separated Hispanic, but I put them back together. Okay, but really, we could still say, okay, this is ridiculous, except that if we go back to 2005, we get two very high-level folks, Porter Goss and James Loy, arguing that emerging intelligence suggests that Al Qaeda has considered infiltrating the U.S. through the Mexican border, and that it would only be a matter of time before they would use a weapon of mass destruction. So there's this sort of longer trajectory of fear that Mexicans will be coming over here, that they will be either the vector through which, or they themselves will have a bone to pick, right? And anybody that follows narratives about the Reconquista and the idea that the Mexicans are coming back and they want to take the land back, right? They have their own bone to pick, or they will just be tools for Al Qaeda to launch its war on us, okay? So what has been the response to this? Whether it's a bio threat in the sense of terrorists or a bio threat in the sense of infectious disease, which I'm sort of positing doesn't really matter anymore, which threat we're addressing, they're all biological danger. What we've seen is there's increased federal funding for all hazard preparedness, right? Bioterrorism and infectious disease, again, it doesn't matter which. We've seen stepped up border security under the guise of a sort of public health protection. We've seen enhanced biosurveillance webs, so a whole spate of labs funded through PAHO and WHO and Homeland Security. Public health workers are trained to identify folks who might look sick, right? And we've seen this through airport security now. There's temperature readers or thermographers or different kinds of technologies, as well as people who are able, like TSA workers are trained to look to see if somebody is sweating and looks very ill. Fusion centers have sprung up everywhere, and for those of you that don't know what fusion centers are, they're sites where Homeland Security, criminal justice, public health, lots of different folks get together, and they are all collaborating to try to see what the next big threat is, the next emerging threat is, and sort of predict, preempt, prevent those threats. And so they've incorporated this idea, the public health focus on infectious disease, into those centers. Google Analytics certainly has its flu trending. You can look at flu trending, right? So you've got digital technologies. Someone told me at a conference I was at a couple weeks ago that the WHO has folks in their basement tweeting, following tweets about who's sick, right? So there's all kinds of, there's a whole network, global network of people who are concerned with infectious disease or some sort of emerging viral threat, right? Okay. So what does this mean? To me, this means that what we see are migrants as a biological threat, the idea that they're moving bodies and they're also mutable bodies. So the conflation of migrants, microbes, and malevolent actors, I'm arguing, exhibits current thinking on the kind of existential threat that migrants are framed as posing to the US body politic. And here you can sort of see the equivalent, right? And within the idea within this sort of viral chaos is that migrants are attacking us from outside by invading our borders. And here's the historic ontological stasis, sort of reconquista, but also from the inside by attacking our biology. And so like terrorist cells, we don't know when or whether they will attack us, and if they do, with what kind of weapon or virulence. Okay, so here's Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. And the unpredictability of mutable microbes marks all mobile bodies as a potential weapon of mass destruction, okay? And what are the implications of this? This means that both their bodies and their culture become open for securitization, right? So now we need to see them as a security threat. Not just their culture, not because certainly we know for those of us that follow immigrant narratives, there are social networks, people are wanting to come to be with their families, rejoining. There's lots of reasons culturally for folks to come here, obviously economic reasons, but also their biology, if we're talking about infectious disease. So which then, as a response, sort of pushes us to want to not only surveil them in a micro level, but to surveil them in a macro level, but also at a micro level, right? So to go beyond the sort of border surveillance technologies that we're seeing now, where we've sort of shipped all of our war technologies, drones, and all the military stuff to the border, but also at a much more micro level to try to figure out what's in their blood and what's in their bodies. So some of the ways that I'm proposing, and this is based on a paper that I've written, so some of the ways that I'm proposing that we deal with this is the way that we would deal with an asymmetric threat, right? That we just don't know, it's a sort of unknown threat, so we have to deal with it in non-traditional ways. And as I said, epicrim or epicriminology, epidemiological criminology is certainly an emerging way to deal with this. So sort of with the focus on epidemiology and sort of criminalization of people who are infected. Okay, and here's a quote basically sort of laying out how it is that we understand viruses to be something that we need to deal with in new ways, and not sort of in the sort of old kind of engage in war with it, but essentially eradicate it. Okay, it's the only way that we'll be able to sort of excise this disease from our polity. Okay. So what happens, not only does this open up a sort of securitizing narrative for Mexican migrants that we need to see them at a molecular level as dangerous to us and then deal with that, but it also obscures a whole host of other things. And so what we see is that, first of all, something that struck me, and this was a huge issue on our campus, was there was a group of researchers in the Netherlands and some other folks in Wisconsin that were funded through the NIH and the DoD to create a flu virus and make it more transmissible than it actually is in nature. So there was significant funds put into it, and they actually could show that they had made this virus that was more transmissible. It passed from ferret to ferret, went through 5 different ferrets. And so the idea is that this is defensive research. This is defensive sort of bioweapons research to be able to protect us and to come up with some sort of response to it should something like this actually happen in nature. And so there wasn't an outcry from folks all over the world about the fact that the US was funding this, that taxpayer money was used to create this weapon. There wasn't an outcry that they were making things that were unnatural. There was no outcry that this research was taking place. And indeed, there was a lot of narrative about the fact that this happens all the time. What was the big deal? The outcry was that this should be published in Nature or Science, and that it sort of would fall into the hands of a nefarious actor, a malevolent actor, someone with malintent, or that indeed one of the scientists working in either of those labs would then have that blueprint to be able to go out and recreate this. And folks within, the science community said, you know what, I'd already seen that paper presented at some conference somewhere. We already knew this existed. There are lots of such blueprints. There's sort of counter discourses to it. But, the US, i.e. us, are putting money into this kind of defensive biological weapons making machine at the same time that we've turned our attention to migrants as potential threats, viral threats. And so I think that there's something for us to think about within that. But that's only one of the things that is obscured. The second is the idea that when swine flu broke, the response globally was Tamiflu, right? Everyone said stockpile Tamiflu. And we did, to the tune of 1.5 billion in this country. And the WHO then pushed it on the global community and said, we all need Tamiflu. Well, there's subsequently been research that not only is Tamiflu not effective for preventing flu, but it also has some really terrible side effects, particularly for children, including blindness, including brain damage. There's a lot of things that we've seen since then. In fact, there was a report that just came out of the British House of Commons, and they are sort of saying, why is it that we were duped into spending so much money on Tamiflu when there's no proven effectiveness? And what was all the hype anyway? Well, when we look a little bit deeper, we see that Donald Rumsfeld was the former chairman of Gilead Sciences, which is the company that makes Tamiflu. And he was not the chairman at the time of the swine flu outbreak, but he was a stockholder, as was Pete Wilson's wife, as was George Shultz. So there's definitely a sort of deeper story about Tamiflu than the one that that we were led to believe through the commercials about its effectiveness. And it's not the only infectious disease scandal that Rumsfeld's been involved in. Can come on in, come on in. So there's also, I recently discovered that he was involved in sales of anthrax and bubonic plague to Saddam Hussein in '93, right? And these are some of the biological weapons that we went to war over, saying that Hussein had biological weapons of mass destruction. And then everyone said, how did we know? Well, this is one of the ways that we knew. And Richard Danzig, a former Navy secretary and consultant to the DHS and Pentagon, he secured $334 million for a biotech startup for anthrax, an anthrax vaccine, which is unproven and has a very short shelf life. And, sort of to his credit, many vaccines do have short shelf life, so we don't want to keep them around if they're not going to be effective. But he claims to be very unaware of the conflict of interest that this posed to the nation and to himself. So, these kinds of scandals are obscured by our focus on running after Mexican migrants, right? Worried about them coming across the border. But it's not just individuals who profit. The US state also profits from this. And this, for me, is the most apparent in the US Global Health Initiative recently launched by President Obama. And so what we get is the US state now can legitimately increase its surveillance web under the guise of protecting public health, right? And especially under the guise of protecting public health from these undocumented migrant bodies, right? So it doesn't just extend its reach to our borders, but it extends its reach indeed to the whole global community, right? This is the sort of aspirations of the Obama administration within its global health agenda. If you look at the 33 partner nations and the other ways that it's coordinated surveillance across the world, it is quite, the tentacles reach to the entire world, right? And this I'm, suggesting is part of the longer history of medicine health as the tool of empire, right? This is nothing new. It's just under a new guise through the molecular lens, okay? So what is it that the Global Health Initiative aspires to? To protect from the spread of infectious disease and under the auspices of saving the lives of the world's most vulnerable people, right? To help build strong, viable nations as, reliable US partners, sorry. And the imperative is that we protect Americans at home from infectious disease by addressing them at the source, right? So here's the sort of global aspirations. We need to go out to the source, whatever that source is. And on the one hand, we say we want to save the lives of the world's most vulnerable population, but on the other, we say it's really about US security, right? It's not just Obama, as I said, or it's not just about the US state, nor about individuals. Certainly, we see that as we fortify the border and as we build more surveillance webs and need more surveillance technologies, there are companies that profit as well, okay? But what's the dirty underbelly of that? Under the guise of protecting vulnerable bodies, under the guise of pushing Tamiflu and really eradicating infectious disease, when swine flu hit, we did not invest in really taking care of the most vulnerable here at home, right? So what we know now is that ethnic minorities suffered the most from this. And I have some narratives in my paper about how farm worker women and farm workers were shunned from local stores here in California. People were told to go home. Children were told not to come to school. The farm worker community really did experience a lot of racism and backlash during this period. So, and of course, these are the ones that are the least likely to have access to preventive care and to health insurance. So under the guise of going out to protect, sort of the nation or the entire globe, we are and did let people suffer right here at home, okay? So, and we know that, when someone has a respiratory infection, that poor living conditions and poor housing conditions and poverty exacerbates those conditions, right? Okay? And there are some who've argued, Charles Briggs among them, that, while ag workers were blamed, industrial food production and factory farming were let off the hook as well, right? So we're focusing on these farm workers, again, focused on the dirty farm workers, and we saw this in the E. coli outbreak, outbreak, when, E. coli in spinach, and we saw those dirty farm workers who are not washing their hands and all of these things. But the factory farmers are off the hook with this, right? I mean, the big industrial farming, okay? And the biotech industry and big pharma are also left unquestioned, right? So Tamiflu is not the problem. It's these dirty migrants. The fact that we're genetically engineering these sort of viral mutants, that's not the problem. All of these kinds of things, because indeed we need all of those industries. At this point, they're just too big to fail, right? And so we'll just let people die but we will keep the industries intact because we need them. So here, Robert Mueller kind of is adding fuel to the fire of why we need to do this. The biodefense industry, and I hear this all the time, is that it's not a matter of if, but when this kind of an outbreak is going to happen. So we need to keep all of these things in place. We need big pharma. We need this kind of research. We need to keep the surveillance webs open because we never know if this could happen. And he says whistling in the jungle. Of course, you don't see the big danger in the jungle because you've been whistling there, right? So if you're whistling in the jungle, you'll never know if the threat is not there. So, but just because we can't see them, they say, doesn't mean they aren't there. It's a question of if, but not when. So sort of to wrap this up, what I'm proposing is that we now have a sort of new immunological form of governance, and that discourses about biosecurity and global health citizenship call for the creation of global surveillance systems, and as Briggs and Nichter have argued, naturalize new forms of governance. So I am proposing that this sort of biological danger narrative that's fomented by virology, immunology, the life sciences, presents to us a new form of governance, okay? And the sort of contours of this new form of governance are, through this ubiquitous, constant, interoperable, comprehensive, vital global network to detect, preempt, and eradicate biological danger at its source, and it's focused specifically at this point on mobile bodies, but mobile bodies that already have been racialized. And you can see kind of how these are meant to work together, right? And in another project, I'm theorizing the implications of migration, health, and security, and these organizations and institutions as too big to fail as a vital security complex, really meant to keep us alive, but of course, on the underbelly of them, letting the most vulnerable die. Okay, so my big fear at this point, and I don't know if I've convinced you that we should be afraid of it, but I certainly have some worries about it, is that it's not just migrants, but all of us could potentially be biological danger within this context, right? And because of this imminent and yet unidentifiable future, we're all enrolled and called upon to engage in surveillance of ourselves and surveillance of others. And here I'm drawing from my work on health promotion, right, and the ways that we are, governmentalized into really monitoring our risk, and the idea that we, have to regulate our behaviors. And so I'm saying that at the same time, because we're all biological beings, we're all potentially biological danger. So this surveillance is also sort of fear and anxiety provoking. So we all worry that we may contaminate or be contaminated. So this is a whole new sort of level of governmentality and governance. Okay, and I'll leave it there. Here, I'm pulling from an image that I think is sort of the contrary to what it is that I'm trying to say, which is that, racialized others make us sick. So this sort of Canadian organization is saying, no, it's racism that makes us sick. So I'm all done. Yeah. Yeah.
Two questions. One is, how long do you think that the perception of threat stays attached to bodies and people after the initial sense of threat? And the other question is, how does this tie into the anti-vaccination campaign?
So how long, the question of how long, I don't know. For me, I think that these narratives are latent, right? And they sort of come up, the idea of the cultural other is one that we can debate, right? That has been going on for a long time. How long does this question of migrants as a sort of viral threat last? Or even Mexicans as a viral threat? It's one that I'm actually going to be submitting an NSF proposal to investigate, right? The idea of, how pervasive is the idea even that these bio threats are out there and that we should be fearful of them. But I can say from a policy perspective, that narrative is very alive and well. It may not be the public dialogue, except for through folks that, like Jay Severin or Rush Limbaugh or whatever. But to the extent that it stays alive as policy and actually is driving a lot, someone came from the DOD and he said, basically gave them a recipe in the GNL for how to get funding from the DOD, and that they needed to write letters to Obama and really push for the fact that we needed more biodefense research of this kind. So I think there's a lot invested financially and politically in keeping this alive at the policy level. That's what worries me more than anything, is that this is a driving force and factor to continue to do the kinds of research and, on the backs of migrants and on the backs of whoever is the latest threat of the day. And the anti-vaccination campaign, I don't know much about it. So I know sort of anecdotally about it, but I don't know how it ties into that. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that well.
I have been thinking a lot about the way that violence is increasingly framed as a pathology. Like there's the Interrupters campaign in Chicago, and the founder of that campaign specifically pathologizes violence. So I was really interested in the epidemiological criminology, and I wonder if you know some people who are working on that, or could point me in the direction of people.
I've only read people who take it very seriously, right? I haven't, so this guy, Mark Lanier, Lanier, he seems to be one of the sort of founders of this movement and really strongly believes in the necessity of it. It really struck me reading what he was writing, because it was really something out of, the 18th century or 19th century sort of anthropometrics meets kind of, the racialized body from the colony. It was really amazing how he framed it, but very convinced of his position. So, I don't know how much traction it will get, but I do know that when Ed Yu from the FBI, Biological Weapons Countermeasures Unit, was interviewed, and you can find this online, he says we are working from an epicrim framework. That's what he's positing. So I had to take it seriously, because they have adopted it as some, and the folks at the GNL, some of them will say, that guy Ed Yu, or the FBI, whatever. I probably shouldn't say that on camera, but they say, take it with a grain of salt. But to the extent that it's the FBI and he's at the head of this unit, I do take it seriously, that he takes it seriously.
Well, one of the lines of work that I'm pursuing with Rebecca, but also by myself, is the sort of neurobiology, the study of neurotransmitters and their associations with certain emotions and states of minds, and the extent to which it may become possible to not just identify these, but to monitor the levels of these things, right? And then that provides sort of early warning, because it's easy to transmit to databases and the like, which is kind of again, everyone says, oh, Minority Report, right? It's very much in that spirit, right? That if you cannot predict the crime, perhaps you can predict who's the potential criminal, and preempt it, right? And so we're sort of back to that 19th century biologism, and I imagine, it probably can be done and it will be done.
And so on that note, one of the things that really struck me, again, like I said, I hang out at the GNL a lot. They had a fellow in from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, and he's a vet by training, but he came in and he was talking about how currently, as in his position as a DTRA employee, he has to sort of operationalize a war fighter perspective, right? So it's about protecting the war fighters in other countries, at home, whatever it takes. And when asked what he would do if he really had his way to protect from any kind of biological or biological weapon, he said, I would alter the biological systems. I would get in and basically tinker with whatever it is that makes that allows for the reproduction of respiratory illness or some sort of infection. And yeah, I can see I know that was what my face looked like. Nobody looked in the least bit bothered by that. But I did think that there was something very profoundly unsettling about that proposition. If we can do it in animals, we can do it in plants, right? And Ronnie and I were just talking about sort of the idea of transhumanism and embedding technologies versus the idea of molecular tinkering, and why one strikes us as much, it's kind of compelling and neat and interesting, and the other one strikes us as profoundly unsettling, right? So I think I would position his comments in that vein. And this is where I sort of get the eradication component of this, is that these are not discourses that are, out of nowhere. These are people who are running agencies who have the kind of scientific background and the political legitimacy to be able to make those kinds of proposals. Yeah.
So, I know you're not necessarily trying to make a kind of causal argument about, where this all came from as such, and, I do work on national security stuff too, and a lot about what happened after 9/11. But you mentioned different things, including the fact that a lot of these are these sort of bureaucratic forces that,
That's right.
9/11 essentially turns everything loose and sets everyone free to do whatever they want, and the money just kind of is rolling in. And then they get established and they perpetuate their own need, right?
Yep.
So you mentioned some of that, and that makes sense to me, right? And there's someone else, Susan Wright, right, who's on campus, a researcher, sort of doing similar stuff related to weapons of mass destruction in terms of who is sort of at the year of the Bush administration before 9/11, and they weren't really getting anywhere, of course. And then after 9/11, it's like, the sky's the limit, right? We can do whatever we want. And, so to me, one of the key arguments, right, is that 9/11 allows, there's this kind of period of 4 to 5 years where essentially no opposition to any of this stuff. Enough money flows in that you create this incredible industry around several categories of new national security mechanisms and so forth. And then by that point, it's sort of too late.
The machine is
up and running, and the NSA and the whole rest of it in terms of the new capabilities. And so in that sense, the Fox News becomes almost like an add-on almost. In the sense that they'll grab onto anything they can find and say those kind of things. But in some ways, it's what. I'm not saying this is everything, but what's persuasive to me is that idea of how quickly you can get this kind of bureaucratic apparatus around something that becomes very powerful. And there's no real opposition, right? So they live on and perpetuate themselves.
No, I think that's right. And I think there's been a lot of effort. And I don't want to discount the cultural elements, right? I don't want to discount the, Contagion, the movie, and, 12 Monkeys, and World War Z, and, all the ways that this kind of gets reproduced, or even at the level of, the ag community. But, I think they work together. But certainly the bureaucracy that, gets put in place, and then the continued fomenting of fear, whether it's fear that we'll lose our funding, or fear that, population X represents the viral danger,
But it dovetails really nicely with the whole sort of wellness and body beautiful movement, you might say, that we're all enjoined to take care of our own health, and to improve it, to measure it, to get DNA analyzed, to anticipate it, right? So there's a sense in which you might say that, the fit is a very nice one, right? And my argument is that part of this is the kind of shift in focus from the state to the individual, as the source of threat to society, and there's a whole argument to be made there. Of course, 9/11 sort of provided the opportunity, but it's already in process before that.
Yeah, in a way, that's the health promotion work has informed that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that actually, and wondering how you are talking about racialization. Because it seems to me that the forms of racialization that you're talking about are about these kind of forms of cleanliness versus modernity diseased body and sort of resurging again.
That's right.
So I was just, and whether you're taking this also to, the images of the pigs and the animal and the human and the new forms of racialization around those conflations and what it means for laboring bodies. And there's so many rich things happening there.
That's right. Around species, animal studies, all these kinds of things, yes.
So I was wondering, how you're really thinking about the forms of racialization as they're being thwarted through new ways and avenues, but also very similar ones. We've seen even, cosmetic surgery as a new form of eugenics in some ways, that people are, remaking themselves in these ways that are about performing themselves as a very healthy body.
Well, one of my intentions out of this project, this is sort of the first cut at it. So I'm going to be submitting a proposal at the end of the summer to actually do ethnographic work on this. And my audience is not, I mean, it will be the public to some extent, but I'm actually really interested in the life science researchers about what they think they're doing in terms of what poses a biological danger. And anecdotally, I've already been asking them, and of course, what do they think are the biological dangers? HIV, AIDS, sort of the parasites that cause diarrhea and kill the majority of the world's population. That's, if you ask them what are the big threats, those are the big threats. Not hantavirus, Marburg, right? It's not anthrax. Those are the one-off big fear ones, right? High catastrophe potential, but low probability. So, but also I'm interested in the life science researchers because so many of our biodefense researchers are foreigners. So many of them come from other countries. So, 1/3 of the workforce in the GNL is, foreign-born. So do they themselves understand themselves as biological danger? So anyway, that's one of the ways I'm interested in cutting it, as well as doing focus groups with the population to ask them kind of, what they think is the biodanger of the moment. So, but yes, it lends itself to a lot of critique and different avenues for thinking about our contemporary moment. I agree with you. Any other questions?
I wanted to go back to, you mentioned popular culture, and I think that's a very interesting line of inquiry. And I wonder if you, in your research, if you find that popular culture is merely reflective of these norms and attitudes and notions of biosecurity and bioterrorism, or if they do help to kind of reproduce and perpetuate these very dangerous logics.
It's an interesting question. One of the things, particularly with regard to this idea of bioweapons, people have said that Clinton got really interested in bioweapons after reading a book by Richard Preston, right? Yeah, and so I think, and certainly I've become a much bigger fan of science fiction. And, people saying, they were setting that up and then someone got that idea and they went off. So, again, the causal argument, I don't know which one does what to what, but I think that they certainly work together. Ronnie has written about this.
Yeah, I've written, a couple of books about this. Is the thing is that it's, there are multiple things going on here, right? Obviously, one has to do with the market for this kind of popular culture. And it's only the society is only receptive, of course, if these kinds of stories are already at large. But then, of course, they start to reinforce, the kind of notion of the story. So there is that kind of dialectic. And it's interesting. You sort of, I remember seeing commentary. Maybe it was in the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle. You see these waves of films that sort of wash through, and then there's the next thing, which is sort of drawing on stories. And you certainly can see this, in Cold War film as well. But
9/11, we get zombies.
yeah, no, we get zombies, but of course then there's the counter thesis that zombies are actually consumers, right? Zombies. There's a difference between vampires and zombies, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but zombies are the consumer, right? And vampires, I think, are the, sex and threat, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's that whole thing, right? And there's an enormous literature on this stuff.
But what's also interesting is the U.S. So this is a way that pop culture actually informed policy, right? The U.S. government paid for a very expensive 5-day zombie apocalypse in San Diego, right? And they hired a company called Halo, and they dressed everybody. You can find it on YouTube. You just YouTube zombie apocalypse Halo, and you'll see that people all made up, and you've got the military with the big Hummers and the big, weapons, and they're shooting, and all these people are walking like zombies, right? And so this is meant to sort of do the same thing that World War Z does, right? It sort of prepares us for the big pandemic or the big, the viral threat that emerges. And so that's a way that, again, pop culture has influenced. there was quite a lot of money spent on that activity, but I think it's definitely worth checking out.
Dan Dresner, who does IR, actually wrote a book a few years ago, which is called something like Theory of
Zombie
International Politics with Zombies, which is applying Ken Waltz's model to zombies, zombie, apocalypse. So it's everywhere.
Yeah, so I mean, that question, it's an interesting one to look at, that intersection, right? Those connections, that relationship.
There's also been a couple movies recently where, like, through genetic engineering or something, bodies are turned into like literal weapons. I just saw a preview for one last. I can't remember what it's called now. I'll have to think about it. But I watched another one with Vin Diesel and Babylon AD. So there was like this like actual creation of like this young girl who's like an actual weapon. Smuggler over the border.
Yeah. I mean, this is the kind of thing that is being proposed, right? That they're going to smuggle in someone who's been infected, akin to a suicide bomber, but it's a different sort of model. But I agree with you. I mean, I think there's something there worth watching for. Maybe I'm too paranoid, but I
think it's a clarifying question about, so in some of the rhetoric that you put up, there was a slide between Al-Qaeda and Mexican migrants, like, and so I'm confused about, because one is a project of bioterrorism and then one is about a bio threat, both of which are threats to the existence of the white body, right, which have to be destroyed, but it seems like it's like that slip is a strange one, so I wonder if you could talk about
between Al-Qaeda and migrants?
Yeah, Mexican migrants, as almost like a Trojan horse bringing it. Like,
Yeah.
what is going on there?
See, I mean, the way I understand that is that slip is allowed for in this comment, right? That it's bioterrorism, it's public health, it's infectious disease, it's Al-Qaeda, it's intentional, it's unintentional, right? That they all fall under biological danger. And they all pose a threat, right, to the existential, the sort of existential threat.
Yeah, it's a threat, if you think about it as race war, it's a threat that has to be just like absolutely just ontologically destroyed for the continued existence of life. And we see that with terrorists, that the terrorists have to be killed, right? I mean, that's sort of the point of war and terror. And do you think that means that movement can also apply to Mexican migrants, like because the only possibility in Foucault's race war is death. It's a discourse of death, actually, although it is about life. So,
I mean, to me, I think, and the discourse is multiple. This is why I think it's something, it's the sort of polyvalent mobility of racism, to use Foucault's terms, right? So it attaches itself differently to different projects. So on the one hand, it is about these migrating bodies and the sort of Mexican migrant molecules that will, mutate and, move. On the other, it is Al-Qaeda using them as a tool. But either way, right, it's about this sort of larger threat. So I think, to me, it's important to follow which of those threats is sort of the threat of the day, but they're very connected and sort of, related. And so, I mean, in another project, I could do this probably in a different way, but follow other kinds of threats, SARS or sort of, Egyptians, or right, and this sort of idea of terrorism and these other bodies and other cultures and the sort of racial discourses. But Mexican migrants are especially charged, right? Precisely because of what Huntington says, because of their geographic contiguity, right? Because they're right next door, because we have this historic relationship with them.
There's also this, this class element. I mean, this cordon sanitaire along the body, right? The border, right? And of course, you have the stories of migrants dying in the desert, right? But in some sense, deportation is kind of the equivalent. Being sent back, it's not death, but there's some sense in, terms of life in the United States, it's extinguishing that possibility.
But do we deport? I mean, we deport, I'm just tongue-in-cheek. We just detain them anymore.
Oh, well, of course.
Just keep them.
We just give them a ride home.
Yeah, just detain them.
Which could be the same thing, though.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, tongue-in-cheek.
Anyway, any other questions or comments?
Okay.
Anything that you guys want to say this would strengthen it or do, sort of improve it? you can certainly, I'm open to those critiques off camera, on camera. But anyway, all right, I'll finish there. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.